It was a beautiful Indian summer day in October 1649 when Admiral Fleming's warship arrived here at Skeppsbron on the edges of the old town in Stockholm. On board was a distinguished passenger who would be at the center of Stockholm's epic fail. At that time, Sweden was a superpower. Spoils from the bloody 30 Years' War saved Sweden's economy, and the war had just ended with the Peace of Westphalia the year before. The 23-year-old Queen Christina made headlines when she declared that she had no intention of getting married and having a successor to the throne. Christina was highly intelligent and was interested in languages, art, science, history, philosophy. She was passionate about collecting artwork and books and rare manuscripts, and even surrounding herself with learned men who could teach her about the world. She had previously invited the Dutch philosopher and political scientist Hugo Grotius to come to Stockholm as royal librarian, but Grotius died in Rostock on his way to Sweden. Christina was good friends of the French ambassador Pierre Chanu. A few years earlier, Chanu had also befriended the philosopher René Descartes. After many years as a mercenary during the 30 Years' War and then as a self-appointed houseguest at various royal courts, Descartes settled down in Amsterdam, where he lived for more than 20 years. He was sociable and had many friends, but he had a constant fear that he wouldn't have peace and quiet for his contemplation in writing. The inherited money he had been living on was now starting to run out, and he was looking for the golden nest egg that he could live on for the rest of his life. So it didn't take long for him to suggest to Chanu that the young Swedish Queen's court might be something for him. So he sent a copy of his book Meditations to the Queen. Now, Christina was interested and began exchanging letters with Descartes. Eventually, she invited him to Stockholm, but Descartes began to get a little bit of cold feet. His previous experience had shown him that most people simply were not capable of absorbing his groundbreaking ideas. He wrote to Chanu that he didn't want to go to the land of bears among ice and stones. And then he wrote another letter for Chanu to deliver to the Queen. He wrote, "Her Majesty was created in the image of God to a higher degree than other humans, and that he therefore could not dare to wallow in the glory of her divine presence." Now, Christina was a person who would not take no for an answer. So she sent Admiral Fleming's warship to Amsterdam to bring back the philosopher and 2,000 books and works of art that she had looted or purchased from all over Europe. According to tradition, Descartes stayed here at Kornhamnstorget with Ambassador Pierre Chanu. Now, Descartes was not a morning person, and he liked to sleep until noon or so. But then he would sit and work until the wee hours of the morning. Although the Queen was very gifted and wanted to learn more about philosophy, she had no time for Descartes once he arrived in Stockholm. He only had one audience with the Queen when he first arrived here. Now, it's a bit unclear, but some history books say that Christina asked Descartes to write the libretto for a ballet called La Naissance de la Paix, The Birth of Peace, which was to be presented on the Queen's birthday. Now, Descartes knew that it was rubbish, and he thought that a comedy was a totally wrong medium for describing the war, which he had seen firsthand. Nevertheless, it was a success with both the Queen and the audience, and the Queen commissioned him to write another musical comedy about two princes who thought that they were shepherds. Descartes wrote to friends in France that a man's thoughts freeze here in the winter. Now, he was saved from this task when he was asked to write the statutes of what later became the Swedish Academy, which was modeled on the French Académie Française. On December 19, 1649, Descartes probably began giving his private lessons to the Queen. The only time she could set aside for him was 5 a.m. At that time of year, the sun doesn't even rise until almost 9 a.m. So several hours before dawn, Descartes had to get up. Remember, he was not a morning person at all. And he had to trudge through the snow-covered alleys up the hill to the castle of Tre Kronor. Now, Descartes' philosophical method was to question everything that was not a fundamentally clear idea. In other words, an idea that is so self-evident that it cannot be doubted. Now, the first building block is summarized in his famous saying, Cogitor ergo sum, je pense donc je suis. I think, therefore I am. In other words, he meant that the very fact of thinking means that there is someone or something that thinks. Now, if I exist, what else is there? Descartes begins with the definition of God as that being a greater than which cannot be conceived. And then he argues that the definition itself must be a fundamentally clear idea. He then goes on to say that existence can no more be separated from the essence of God than the idea of a triangle can be separated from the fact that the sum of its three angles is equal to two right angles, that is 180 degrees. For Descartes, it was equally obvious that God exists, because a God who exists is a greater being than one who is only a nice idea but who does not exist. To him, the idea of a non-existent God was as inconceivable as a triangle that had four sides. And now a God who exists by logical necessity is also a greater being than a God who just happens to exist. Well, I'm not going to delve into the strengths and weaknesses of his version of the ontological argument for the existence of God, but it was from this foundation that he also reasoned his way to the existence of the world, and much, much more. Now, for Queen Christina and Descartes, it was not love at first sight. The Queen's library was not heated, and Descartes had to stand there shivering and bareheaded throughout his philosophy lessons. Now, it soon became clear that they just didn't like each other. She disliked his mechanical approach to things, and he didn't appreciate her interest in the ancient Greeks. Descartes had never had much time or use for the classics. In fact, he thought that they were just a waste of time. Their science was outdated and false, and their morality had been superseded by Christianity. And in his not so humble opinion, too many people quote the ancient Greeks instead of just thinking for themselves. The harsh Stockholm winter and the ungodly morning hours were just too much for Descartes. He fell ill with influenza and pneumonia, and he died on February 11th, 1650. Queen Christina wanted to give Descartes a state funeral and a final resting place here in Ridderholm Church, where Sweden's royalty are buried. But that would take some planning. And soon Christina became too distracted with plans for her own coronation. So the state funeral and the prestigious burial never took place. Although Descartes was very religious, it was considered inappropriate for him to be buried in a Lutheran church or cemetery, simply because he was Catholic. So he was buried under a simple wooden cross in a cemetery for unbaptized infants. The site, which was then far from the city center, is here in what is now the cemetery at Adolf Fredriks Church. 17 years later, in 1667, Descartes' remains were moved to Paris, where they are now buried in l'Église de Saint-Germain-des-Prés. Well, not quite. It turned out that Descartes' head was missing. It turned up in Stockholm in 1821. Apparently, one of the men who exhumed Descartes' body stole it and sold it to a collector. Today, Descartes' skull is in the Musée de l'Homme in Paris. And Descartes' right index finger is also missing, and no one knows where it is. So if you have it, give it back. When Adolf Fredriks Church was built in the 1770s, King Gustav III commissioned this memorial to Descartes. It says, Gustav, King of Sweden, erected this monument to René Descartes, born in France in 1596 and died in Sweden in 1650. The theme is truth, which is symbolized here by the globe, liberated from lies, implicitly by Descartes' philosophy and science. So there you have it. Stockholm's greatest contribution to the history of philosophy was to kill off one of the most original thinkers in 800 years. It was truly an epic fail.